Hi, Annette. Welcome to our podcast, The Artist. And thank you so much for joining in again and taking out time after the most loved conversation on Kieślowski. This is on François Truffaut. And I'm so grateful that you took out time to be here to discuss all about Truffaut and the book that you wrote on him, but more about him as the person Truffaut and the films that he has made. So, welcome to the podcast again.
Thank you very much.
If I had to ask you about Truffaut and ask you to describe him in 5 words, what would that be?
I have to think about that. Shy,
Okay.
generous,
Mm-hmm.
brilliant,
Mm-hmm.
kind,
Mm-hmm.
humane.
Wow. Something what really stands out is shy. Shy as a person and shy as somebody, a shy filmmaker. How would you describe a shy filmmaker going out there and making films that got loved by the world? 400 Blows, Jules and Jim. How
In
would you
the
describe that?
When he was on set directing a
Yeah.
film, he was
Yeah.
not shy. But
Wow.
in personal interactions, he was.
Mm.
I did not sleep all night
Mm.
before the day that I was going to meet him for the first time, when he
Mhm.
came to New York for the New York
Wow.
Film Festival. I think it was for The Man Who Loved Women, or it was for Small Change.
Mm.
And when I arrived at his hotel room at the Sherry Netherland,
Mm.
I realized that he was quite nervous. I told him that I hadn't slept because I was so excited. And he said, "Oh, I'm quite nervous too. It's very difficult for me to meet new people, especially if I think that they can control something about how my work will be seen and understood." So
Wow.
it was very, what's the word I'm looking for? Relaxing for me to know that he too had been nervous about meeting me. Thus far,
Yeah.
we have only corresponded by mail. You must remember
Wow.
that in the late 1970s,
Yeah.
there was no email. There weren't even faxes.
Yeah.
Everything was basically letters that took
Wow.
sometimes a week or two, to reach one another.
Yeah.
I came of age in the 70s, not, the year 2026. And we had a wonderful correspondence when I first wrote him that I had been commissioned to write a book about his work for a
Yeah.
new series in the United States called Twain Publishers. He
Mhm.
immediately answered, and
Wow.
he offered to send me materials to help.
Wow.
Now, so he
Wow.
was extremely not shy when it came to
Mm.
writing beautiful letters, but
Mhm.
always, if you know the distinction in French between the vous, which is the respectful way of addressing someone, versus tu, you.
Mm.
Tu is familiar. It
Mm.
suggests that, there's no hierarchy between you that you're on. So he was very elegant and polished in his letters, always writing me as vous. And
Mm.
even in person, after years together, when we knew each other well, he would still say vous to me and I to him.
Mm.
Somehow we had gotten used to the more formal address. When I
Mm.
said shy, I saw, for example, that it wasn't that easy for him to meet new people, Americans especially, but he
Yeah.
always overcame that shyness. When I was his translator in
Mhm.
1979, at the moment that the American Film Institute did a retrospective, it was the 20th
Mm.
anniversary of him as filmmaker. There were all
Mhm.
these parties for him in Los Angeles with celebrities galore.
Mhm.
And he depended on me for translation.
Wow.
But I remember one or two cases where my translation was sort of not necessitated, like Barbara
Mhm.
Streisand
Mm.
grabbing him at a party and whisking him into a private room. I just stood there, okay, because she wanted to, as he later told me, pick his brain, because she was about to
Yeah.
direct her own first feature, Yentl. So even if he was
Wow.
kind of shy, women and men sometimes could just, take him over and he would have to.
Yeah. Wow, wow, that's such a great anecdote. Barbara Streisand just whisking him to another room, and it was because she was trying to make her first film. And
Right.
you were his first translator, and he sort of
Not his
felt
first.
that it was,
I just want to correct one thing. I
yeah.
became his translator in 1979 after my
Hmm,
book about his work came out, but his
right.
primary translator up till then and sometimes still after was Helen Scott,
Yes.
Scott. Her name
Yeah.
found on the Hitchcock Truffaut
Yes.
interview book because she
Yeah. Yeah.
facilitated all those conversations. So I
Yes.
just to be clear that she was
Yeah.
the person
Yeah.
I was the primary.
So Helen Scott, yes, we sort of. I'm going to be asking some more questions on the Hitchcock Truffaut thing, which is one of the chunk of the conversation. But coming to the point, Annette, you mentioned that it was not easy for him to meet new people, and his, when he started making his films, 400 Blows was actually his coming from his own personal life. What was his inner life at that point when he made the film?
Well, we have to contextualize the 400 Blows
Hmm.
within the French New Wave.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because 1959 was the year not only of his first feature, but
Hmm.
Breathless and Hiroshima
Yeah.
Mon Amour. And film language itself had been changing, becoming far more personal because of handheld cameras and more accessible microphones. And Truffaut had been a well-known French film critic in the 1950s.
Yeah.
With the 400 Blows, he was establishing what I call cinema in the first person singular. You could
Hmm.
compare this to novels that have an omniscient third person narrator, or sometimes the novel has a voiceover narrator, right?
Yeah.
And for Truffaut, this became an extremely personal exploration. He was quite young at the time. Don't forget, he was born in 1932, was a
Yeah.
child during World War II, and had, well, I won't waste our time going into all the details that I'm sure most of our
Yeah.
audience knows of how
Yeah.
he, matured into filmmaking. I think that the act of making 400 Blows and some of his other films was a cathartic experience. He was still dealing with some demons, namely
Yeah.
having been an unwanted child.
Yeah.
I think he knew that Roland Truffaut uh, gave him a name. In other words, recognized him as a son, though he was not biologically his
Yeah.
father, I mean his stepfather.
Yeah.
And his mother gave birth to Francois when she was 19.
Oh my God.
And
Yeah.
she really didn't know how to raise a child and kind of left him to be raised by his grandmother, basically raised by his grandmother. And the wonderful story that I learned from the biography of Truffaut that was written by Serge Toubiana and Antoine de Beck, because Truffaut never told me this.
Hmm.
He didn't know who his biological father was. However,
Hmm.
in 1968, when he made Stolen Kisses, which is about
Yeah.
Antoine Doinel becoming a detective, he hired the same detective agency that was a consultant on Stolen Kisses to track down his own biological father.
Oh
And
my
he
God.
learned that he was Roland Lévy, Levy, still alive, a dental surgeon in another part of France who was Jewish.
Oh
And
my
this
God.
is all part of a whole other large story.
Yeah.
But he was a good deal older when he found this out. And he didn't even go
Wow.
to talk to the man. He saw him. He saw his biological father, but he realized what was he going to say? Hello, I'm your son. It didn't make sense. He left. He left right away to
Wow.
get out of his car. So for the
Wow.
400 Blows, he was, in a sense, exorcising some of his demons. He had
Yeah.
juvenile delinquent and a petty thief. Um,
Yeah.
he was working through his complicated feelings about his mother. But at the same
Wow.
time, here's where I come in as a film scholar and educator.
Yeah.
The way that he told the story was so magnificent in the details of childhood without ever being sentimental. There is
Yeah.
emotion in the film, but for
Yeah.
example, he directed Jean-Pierre Léaud, his first time on film. He said, "Don't smile too much. You don't want to make the camera love you. You just be who you are." And that was Truffaut. I mean, he has so many love stories in his
Yeah.
cinema, but rarely does he get into a sentimental depiction of relations.
Yeah.
He also
Yeah.
does not do a lot of graphic sexual scenes. It's all
Yeah.
more indirect,
Yeah.
suggest, left to us to interpret and to feel the richness.
Yeah, lovely, lovely, and that's such a beautifully, it's such a beautiful anecdote, and what you just said, what you just shared about him as a human, as a person, what he actually went through, and how he depicted his inner life in 400 Blows. So tell me, Annette, he spent, before he made the film, he was a film critic. He 8 years already with Kahir's to Cinema. He was already working. He understood film criticism. He was already a known name. And when he actually got to directing, and this is something I constantly try to understand, how does a director get his film criticism out when he is or she is directing a film? Any thoughts on that while you were interacting with him?
Well, I have read many of the articles that he wrote for Cahiers du Cinéma and other
Yeah.
outlets, and I can tell you that they often read less like film reviews and more like Truffaut telling the director what he should have done. In other words, they are the reviews of a frustrated critic who is
Mm.
clearly itching to be behind the camera himself.
Mm.
When he started to make films, beginning with the 400 Blows, although let us not forget that he also made short films before, like Les
Yeah.
Mistons, The Brats. And that was actually quite good, about
Mm.
15-20 minutes, black and white, Bernadette Lafont.
Mm.
Um, Once he was making films, he no longer felt the need to attack other filmmakers in print. That ended. And whatever he wrote after 1959 tended to be only when he was celebrating the work of a given filmmaker or the movie itself. Something that I have always taken to heart. I mean, I knew this when I was um, just loving Truffaut's movies, just as a little cinephile when I was in my teens, let's say.
Yeah.
I myself, once I started writing about film,
Yeah.
was asked to do reviews. Um,
Mm.
and I wrote for the New York Times Arts and Leisure section for 79, 89, over 20 years. I
Mm.
refused to write reviews because I
Mm.
never wanted to be the arbiter of taste who has to attack talented people who were trying hard and didn't succeed.
Yeah.
Truffaut was like a model for me of initially what you shouldn't do, like what he was writing in the 50s because he was frustrated. But
Yeah.
after that, of what you should do, which
Yeah.
is to write about film only from the perspective of appreciation. Whatever you think
Mm.
is so good, just ignore it. It doesn't deserve print. So
Yeah.
that I've lived my whole life. And when I teach film at Columbia, I
Yeah.
don't ever show, quote, an unsuccessful film, nor do I speak ill of any filmmakers. I simply
Mm.
choose what I think are the best, the most inspirational films, so that they have a model, especially if they're screenwriters, directors, producers, to aspire to.
Wow. Wow, that is so beautiful. I hope more and more people listen to this and understand what you've just said. And tell me, in terms of the language of Truffaut, uh, uh, he used freeze frames, he used voiceovers. What are, what are the things that, according to you, he deliberately used to convey feeling or design his language that was felt by the audience?
There are many aspects to his cinematic choices,
Mm.
beginning with the 400 Blows and continuing right up to his last film, Confidentially Yours.
Yeah.
I would say that first and foremost, he considered himself a cinematic storyteller.
Mm.
Very different from, let's say, his buddy Godard. They were very close in 1959. Truffaut wrote the original treatment for Breathless, but
Yes.
they drifted apart in a rather acrimonious way years later.
Mm.
Godard was not that interested in being an accessible cinematic storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to, uh, you know, the term in French, épater la bourgeoisie. It comes from the 19th century. Shock
Mm.
the bourgeoisie, which is what
Yeah.
writers like Flaubert were doing with Madame Bovary.
Yeah.
Um, and he became much more essayistic, didactic, idiosyncratic in his movies. Many of my students prefer Godard to Truffaut. But what I love about Truffaut's work is that he used cinematic vocabulary to make us both feel and think about his characters. He once said that for him, a great film had to have both an idea of the cinema and an idea of the world. And what I think he meant by that is that it has to, you know, present a good story, well told with compelling characters, yes, but it should also have a second layer, a self-consciousness that essentially came into cinema big time with the French New Wave, where you become aware of not only the story, but how it's being told. So, for example, he created so much kinetic excitement in the 400 Blows when he had Antoine Doinel on that zoetrope type thing where the machine is moving so fast and he's pinned against the wall. There's something exhilarating about that. But I said zoetrope because it resembles the origin of cinema. There are so many lovely allusions in Truffaut's motion pictures to other films and filmmakers, as well as literature. Yesterday, by coincidence, I showed in my class at Columbia University, the course is called Analysis of Film Language, and it's for graduate students in screenwriting, directing, and producing. I showed Day for Night. And I was shocked initially when I asked how many had seen the film. Out of 70 students, one. So I said to the class, that's why I exist. I show you films that you wouldn't see otherwise, right? And they were really touched, but didn't get most of the allusions. I had to explain to them that at one point in Day for Night, where Truffaut plays the character, the director Ferrand of the film within the film, Ferrand receives a package of books. And as he opens the package, you have this lyrical, beautiful, romantic music of Georges Delrue playing, the music that Delrue already wrote for Truffaut's Two English Girls before. And what comes out is books about directors. So you see Lubitsch, Hawks, Hitchcock, Dreyer, Bresson. And it's a love scene. It's a love scene between the books and the camera, heightened by the score. Only Truffaut could have a scene like that. But Day for Night also has allusions to so many other things, like Jean Cocteau. You see a tapestry by Jean Cocteau in the background. And Truffaut had been blown away by Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast, Testament of Orpheus. So Truffaut loved his Beauty and the Beast and Orpheus and the Testament of Orpheus, Blood of a Poet. I had to explain that to my class. So the other thing I would mention is his use of black and white for films, especially The Wild Child, in which Truffaut also plays the lead role of Dr. Itard. This true story that took place in another century was in black and white, and it had the quality of a journal that was being kept by the doctor. The voiceover narration, and you had mentioned that earlier, it is one of his trademarks, but I do not know of any other director who uses voiceover in the same way. Namely, not to provide a comforting, paternal presence. Oh, here's what happened once upon a time. No, his voiceovers in Jules and Jim also dry, flat, fast. It's almost like he's providing a distancing counterpoint verbally to the lush action visually. He likes photographs.
Yeah.
And his mastery of film language, which, by the way, probably was the result of so many years of watching every possible kind of movie, whether when he played hooky during his childhood from school to go to the movies, or when after the German occupation of France ended, he and his buddies would go to the Cinémathèque Française to catch up on all the films that had been banned during the occupation. So they were watching gangster films and westerns and musicals and films from other countries. So he blended
Wow.
that in such a rich way.
Yeah, yeah. I just saw an interview where Renoir mentioned about Truffaut being an effortless filmmaker, and he was absolutely jealous of him, especially about Jules and Jim. And he said this is the most marvelous film he has seen. So when we say an effortless filmmaker, he said an effortless filmmaker destined to be a filmmaker, somebody who deeply understands cinema. What are the qualities that actually made him an effortless filmmaker, and was it closely connected again to where he was coming from since childhood?
I'm going to think about this just a little bit.
Yeah.
And first, before I answer your question, Jean Renoir was possibly the most important filmmaker in terms of inspiring Truffaut in
Mm.
his style and in his, what I would call, humanistic vision.
Mm.
Uh, in my book, I have an entire chapter
Mm.
on Renoir and Truffaut, who made, in my opinion, similar kinds of films
Yeah.
in which characters are absolutely fallible and sometimes so silly, and
Yeah.
yet you feel the vulnerability of the character and you accept and you have affection for, if not sympathy with, that character.
Yeah. Yeah.
Effortless is an intriguing word because it all seems effortless.
Yes.
I've been on enough sets, including Truffaut, his own film, The Man Who Loved Women. He invited me to
Yes.
the set in Montpellier. This was around 1977,
Yeah.
when I had essentially finished most of my book
Yeah.
about his work. And he finally agreed to meet with me in France and invited me there.
Yeah.
In Day for Night, you actually see the director is besieged by every single person asking about decisions and help, whether it's props or technical things or finances or scheduling. And it's overwhelming what a director has to do. It all seems effortless, but it takes a lot of work to mask the effort. But I think what Renoir was referring to is that when we see a Truffaut film, there's a kind of accessibility. We have to work to understand the details. We have to pay close attention to them. But it's not like Godard, who almost forces you to consult a couple of texts after you see the film to figure out what the hell he was alluding to. So there's that. And because you always know in a film by Truffaut, even if he's tweaking a genre, even if he's presenting a character who is duplicitous, like Catherine Deneuve's character in Mississippi Mermaid, you don't know what to think, but you start to understand where that character is coming from. The Bride Wore Black would be another example. Both of these films were made in the 60s during his, quote, Hitchcockian period. They
Yeah.
came right around after he had done the interview book with
Yeah.
Hitchcock. And they have a darker strain, certainly, than Shoot the Piano Player or later Small Change or, well, one of my favorites is The Last Metro. These are less dark, even if some of the scenes have a darkness.
Mhm. So I was also listening to, a couple of. I'm still to refinish a few of the episodes, the audio between Hitchcock and Truffaut. But he went to the Hollywood studios. He was there with him for 8 days, and he managed to interview him and get 50 hours of that entire conversation, which was later also made into a book, Hitchcock Truffaut. Why was Truffaut so obsessed, if that's the right word, or intrigued, if that's another right word, with Hitchcock, when actually, when you see Truffaut and Hitchcock, there's literally no common ground between the two of them as filmmakers and also as people?
Obsessed and intrigued are not bad words. I don't think it was either one. I
Hmm.
think that he was a fan. He was
Wow.
an admirer. Why? Because he realized that Hitchcock um, was the textbook. His films were the textbook for learning
Hmm.
how to do mise en scène, when
Yeah.
to use montage, how to use music, if at all, and the key thing for me, how to create suspense as opposed to surprise. In the
Wow.
book, Hitchcock and Truffaut make a clear distinction. Surprise is momentary. Suddenly a bomb goes off and you go, "Oh!" Suspense is the opposite.
Yeah.
Only the audience knows what's about to
Yeah.
happen, that the bomb is underneath the train car seat.
Yeah.
Um, and we have no idea when it'll go off. And we sit there for at least 10 seconds, so
Yeah.
scared. Is it going to kill everybody? That's suspense,
Yeah.
whether the bomb ever goes off or not. And
Yeah.
it's far more dramatically useful in a motion
Yeah.
picture.
Yeah.
It's not just that. I think Truffaut knew Hitchcock's films intimately, and he was able to ask the
Hmm.
kinds of questions that elicited answers that make the Hitchcock Truffaut book one of the best ways to learn how to make a film.
Yeah.
Now, you have to know that Truffaut wrote his screenplays, especially in collaboration with Suzanne
Yeah.
Schiffman and others.
Yeah.
Hitchcock did not really write his scripts. In fact, most of the films are written by different people.
Yeah.
And yet we know there's a Hitchcockian vision.
Yeah.
Truffaut had been fascinated by this already in the 1950s when he and his Cahiers du Cinéma colleagues elevated American filmmakers who previously had been considered craftsmen at best. They were elevated into auteur status,
Mm. Mm.
partly because Truffaut and others were able to discern, despite the collaborative nature of filmmaking, a particular vision that was
Yeah.
Hitchcock's,
Yeah.
expressed through recurring stylistic elements that were Hitchcock's. And
Yeah.
I think Truffaut learned so much from that and from Hitchcock at the
Yeah.
same time that he learned so much from Renoir, which
Yeah.
had more to do, I think, with the depth of the frame, with long takes, with close ups, because Renoir's vision was so inclusively generous. He
Yeah.
rarely had outright villains in his film, and I think that's true of Truffaut as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Lovely. So, and it's when he was a fan of Hitchcock, and like you just mentioned, Hitchcock had a very different style of making films. He really participated in script writing. Truffaut always was one of the writers. Hitchcock was more in the suspense space. He even storyboarded his films, whereas Truffaut never, he was more impromptu. He never even rehearsed with his actors. His actors were not even sort of kind of known. He would just go on the set. He would start working with them. These two different styles in it of filmmaking. What was Truffaut searching? And after he actually met and recorded these interviews, did he incorporate anything in his filmmaking from Hitchcock?
Okay, there's a lot there to unpack. And I'm not sure I agree with you that he just went onto the set and improvised. Actually, Truffaut
That's
was a
what he.
he
That's
was
what
a
he just meant. Yeah. Okay. A lot of
he
his
was a
interviews say that. Yeah.
sometimes
Yeah.
he was a bit of a
Yeah.
control freak. I mean,
Right.
he really absolutely was a perfectionist.
Hmm.
Renoir was much more improvisatory. Truffaut
Hmm.
was improvisatory with his actors. He
Hmm.
wanted his actors to feel comfortable.
Hmm.
He would whisper something different to one
Hmm.
actor, to Jean-Pierre Léaud, for example. This is your scene where you're going to do this. And he would whisper to, Jacqueline Bisset, okay, this is your scene and you're going to do this. And then, I mean, there was some rehearsal. I
Yeah.
wouldn't say there was no rehearsal. That would be, I think, impossible. But he was very open to change and he revered his
Hmm.
actors.
Hmm.
Hitchcock famously once said, actors are like cattle. Um, you know, they were figures to be manipulated in
Yeah.
his scenario.
Yeah.
Truffaut was much more of a humanist, and it's this is not unrelated to the fact that he so often fell in love with his leading ladies. I mean, he
Hmm.
had many, many. I think I called him the diminutive practitioner of dangerous liaisons. He was not tall.
Yeah.
Some of the French directors who were most successful with women, Louis
Yeah.
Malle, Truffaut, Godard, not tall.
Yeah.
But, in the late 50s, it was a given that there would be liaisons
Yeah.
among the actresses and the director. It was a
Hmm.
given.
Hmm.
So he would be in love, let's say, with Isabella Gianni uh, or Catherine Deneuve or whatever. So that was the fine line, that your gaze on this woman about whom you have amorous feelings
Yeah.
is anchoring your frame. So
Hmm.
you shoot them with love, but then you presumably edit with control.
Now I was at an AI studio the other day and I actually saw the entire pipeline of AI films getting made, and I was a bit sort of like, wow, where are we really heading? And when I listen to Truffaut and Hitchcock audio series, and when I see how these filmmakers have actually got a grasp of cinema and so much of interaction between writers and directors and actors to actually get that scene right, versus you are talking about an AI film pipeline. Where do you see this would have headed if Truffaut was part of this AI filmmaking, the entire thing that's happening right now? Where do you see cinema going? Do you see cinema happening once we are fully adapting to AI in the way it's happening right now?
Well, um, let's not forget that
Hmm.
one of the films Truffaut directed was
Hmm.
Fahrenheit 451.
Hmm.
It was in the early 60s. He was, or mid 60s, he was already addressing the
Hmm.
fine line between the human and the mechanical. Ray
Hmm.
Bradbury's story was about
Hmm.
a
True.
futuristic society in
Hmm.
which firemen exist not to put out fires, but to burn books. It was
Hmm.
a totalitarian kind of society in which many of the people acted in robotic ways, including the protagonist Montag, played by Oscar Werner, who had been so appealing in Jules and Jim. But Montag has an awakening, and it
Yeah.
has to do with what Truffaut saw as the necessary uniqueness, not only of every human being, but of every book. He loved books
Yes.
as well as movies.
Yeah.
And I think for Truffaut, the whole development of AI would have
Yeah.
been a source of anxiety. Not simply that it could replace screenwriters, directors, actors, but that it was allowing a technological creation to supersede human idiosyncrasy. I think he would not be happy with it at all,
Yeah.
and would continue. I mean, had he lived, my goodness, he died so young at the age of 52 back in 1984. He didn't live to see all that would develop at the end of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st. I like to think of him as having been protected by his
Yeah.
early death from the awareness that the medium he loved so much might be changing, that it
Yeah.
might not require the joy of being on set with real actors
Yeah.
And he didn't just cast unknowns and he didn't just cast stars. He
Yeah.
always had a combination of the two,
Yeah.
except for films that are less populated by characters like The Wild Child, which had only a few central characters. But if you think about Stolen Kisses, Day for Night, The Last Metro, as just a few examples, to yeah, those have many secondary characters in addition to primary. Um, there's life. There's rich life in the people that his camera photographs.
There's rich life in the people, the way the camera photographs. Tell me, Annette, now as we're heading towards mass production of films through AI, and what AI can do is, oh my God, the way it's progressing, it just looks that the camera has been totally replaced by AI. And when we have headed and entered this era, do you see that kind of cinematic films that have been created already by Hitchcock and Truffaut, do you think that we'll be able to reach the depths of cinema through AI? What are your thoughts when it comes to AI and cinema?
Um, all I know is that cinema, the act of writing a film by a human being or
Yeah,
two, the act of making the film and the act of editing a film, I do not believe these will go away. And the number of students applying to Columbia University's film school and
yeah,
elsewhere,
yes,
the number of film festivals that have grown and grown around the world, it's too good to let AI take over. I mean, I teach film history as opposed to filmmaking,
yeah,
but what I show tends to inspire my students because they can hear the personal voice of filmmakers, not necessarily just the director, the screenwriter as well, and sometimes the creative producer.
yeah.
I mean, maybe I'm just a cockeyed optimist. I always have been. I refuse to look at the future in terms of doom and gloom. And hey, nobody's going to make movies anymore but AI. I just don't believe that.
Yeah, yeah, totally. So, yes, there has to be a human element, human participation in it. Perhaps maybe with different tools. We don't know how this is going to pan out in the next couple of years. But cinema is not going anywhere, that's for sure, no matter what happens. So, on that note, thank you so much, Annette. I really appreciate your time and being here and giving such detailed anecdotes. I'm sure the audience is going to love this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.